It's time we talked about this. And I've been putting off making this video for a while now for a couple of reasons. The first being primarily that I have not a lot of good things to say about this book, and I don't like making negative videos in general. But I do think this is something we need to talk about. So we are going to review this book today, and we're going to talk about what, as always with a review on this channel, we're going to talk about what's good, what's bad, and what I thought was indifferent in this product from Games Workshop for Legions Imperialis. So let's get started. And as always, let's start off with the good things about this book. And there are some good things, and some good things about this expansion to the game just in general. And the first being that this book has a lot of really good color plates. And I think this one was on Warhammer Community, so I can show you. But this is a Forge World style plate. Um, it's miniatures that have been photoshopped to look like they're in they're in combat in real life, like it's a combat photographer's photo. And I really like this style, and I'm really glad to see. Um, and maybe I'll put an image of the one that was on Warhammer Community so you can see it better. But I really like this style. I think it really suits the Horus Heresy. It's very gritty, very realistic, which in some ways is funny because the Horus Heresy has always had this more realistic style, and that usually involves like lots of chipped paint, lots of, like I said, gritty, um, old school modeling techniques applied to it. Whereas 40K, even though it's all about the grim, dark, far future, it has always had more of a colorful polychrome look to it. But anyway, great plate there. There's only one of those, unfortunately. I'm sure they're not easy necessarily to produce, and I'm sure they take a fair bit of work. So for a book that's this size, I can understand why there's maybe only one. There's plenty of other great shots, though, and I think this one was on Warhammer Community as well. But you get this great double spread of the Salamanders with their Solar Auxilia cohort in support, and they're on the battlefield of Istvan. And you got some knights in the background, and there's plenty of others. There's also plenty of color plates. Um, in the sense that they show, let's see, not just photographs of the miniatures, but there's lots of plates that show individual miniatures, like this one of the Fellblade, and you have plenty of others showing the different formations. So these were really good. I was really glad to see the return of these plates after some of the previous expansions hadn't really featured them much at all. And there's quite a few in this book, and quite a few more that show the formations themselves with their own color plates with all the tanks listed out, and infantry, and so on, and aircraft. So really pleased to see that. And I think some of these are available in Warhammer communities, some of them are not. So there's some value in this book, in that there's very clearly some effort has gone into the production of those color plates and these photographs. The other good things about this expansion in particular, I would say, are the models. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Saturnine aesthetic in general, but I have to admit that the figures and the new dreadnoughts really look good from a technical perspective. Like whatever challenges Games Workshop had at the beginning of Legions Imperialis with the sprue gates that caused so much controversy, they seem to have overcome those. And these Saturnine figures are very detailed. They're even very small still, and they don't have, as far as I can see, any of that sprue gating problem. And they're really well detailed. They're characterful. They look great, and I think it's definitely a slam dunk from Games Workshop here as far as the miniatures go. I think for me personally, my favorite release was the Fellblade and its variants. So I've always been a fan of the Fellblade. I think it's a great looking miniature and just a great looking tank in general. And I think all of the variants, even the Ascalon, which I was a little bit suspicious of, I didn't really quite like the look of it at first based on what I had seen on Warhammer Community in the previews, but having seen it in person now, it looks much better. I actually quite like it. I think it looks like a great tank on the battlefield. So all in all, I know that's not necessarily quite related to the book itself, but the miniatures for this release have been really outstanding. So I have to commend Games Workshop for that. So that's unfortunately the last of the good things that I'm going to say about this book. And we're going to go into the bad things. And the first bad thing is the maps. And I know James, in the Warhammer Community article, I don't know if he listened to my video that I made, or one of my streams where I talked about wanting more maps, more color plates, and so on. And that seemed to have been called out in the Warhammer Community article. So James, I do have to apologize, but unfortunately, the map that's included here is just not acceptable. And I mean, this is a Games Workshop product, so obviously they can do whatever they like. But for me, this is not an acceptable product, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. So here's the map, and the first thing that drove me crazy about this map, not in a good way, is you put the central action in the spine of the book. So you have all of this space over here dedicated to the landing zones, the surrounding of the traitor forces, of the loyalists. You've got this giant volcano over here, but the actual combat is in the center of the spine. So you can't really, you can't really see what's going on. You really have to bend the book apart to see the positions. Drives me crazy. And I guess I can't blame you too much because there are other publishers that do the same thing, but I don't know. I don't know why you would do this. Maybe just out of ease of publishing, but this is not the way to do it. The main focus should be easy to see. It should be maybe on this side or this side, and then you have the supporting detail in the center, right? Stuff that's not the main focus of your book that you're writing about. Okay. So first problem, number one, don't put the main area of operations on the spine of the book. I don't know if that means you put a map here and a map here and split it up that way or what, but this is not okay. The other problem that I have with this map is that there's basically no detail. Okay, so you've got some positions here, but like what is landing here? I know it's word bearers. Is it like how many? What's their force composition? What's their objective? What part of the battle is this? Okay, so it's not really clear. You know, you've got these fortified positions, I guess, the Sons of Horus up here on the mountainside. But like, where are their positions? I mean, this is so vague. It's just not very interesting. The other thing that drove me crazy is you've got these void shields over here. What are they defending? There's two giant void shields right here. There's no forces positioned under them. What's their purpose? You've got this one, which, okay, I can understand. There's these Emperor's Children forces. This is where Horus has his headquarters. But what about these secondary void shields? What is their purpose? Are they there to prevent the enemy from flanking, from bombarding? Is there traitor forces involved? Are they fortified here? What's going on? So that's another thing. You're also not showing the progression of the battle. Like you've got some movement arrows, you've got some stuff going on, but how is the battle being fought? This is one phase of the battle, but this engagement lasted for a long time and had multiple different phases. So how does it develop? You're not really showing, to my mind anyway, how the battle progresses over time. You're also not showing where the Solar Auxilia are, where the Imperial Army are. I think you've got some Titans here, right? The Legio Mortis. But where's the Legio Ataris, which dropped alongside the Loyalists? I don't think they're on here. So there's a lot of stuff missing from this map. And just out of curiosity, I looked up on Warhammer Community, and turns out there's another map, which I'll show over this footage, that actually has some of the detail that I'm talking about right now. And so that makes me wonder, like, I paid however much for this book, $25, $35, and you're giving me a map that's worse than the one that I can get for free online. So why am I buying this? So the next problem that I have with the maps is that there's no inset maps, like throughout the narrative. And in all previous campaign books, especially the Great Slaughter, and it's become fewer and fewer as the campaign books have been released. But there's no inset maps showing the action being described in the narrative. So for example, let's look back at our big map showing the whole drop site massacre. This book is supposed to focus on the Salamanders, but it's showing the whole area of interest, area of influence. But the Salamanders are right there, right? Right there. That's really all that we're supposed to care about in this book. So how are we supposed to follow the action of the narrative when you're not showing us what the Salamanders are actually doing, other than like moving back here to attack the word bearers? So really, there needs to be a smaller map showing what the Salamanders are doing. And that reminds me also, isn't there supposed to be a giant Xenos fortress right here that Horus makes his headquarters? So where's that on the map? Did you guys just forget about this? I mean, that was a big part of the reason that Horus picked this place, because there were pre-existing fortifications. So again, going back to the inset maps, there should be throughout the narrative smaller maps that show what's going on a local level so that the reader can follow what's going on. Okay, so what I will do, I will come out to London Games Workshop, pay for my flight, my lodging. I will come out and I will teach your writers operational terms and graphics, and we will fix this together. I won't even ask for a commission. Just pay for my flight and my lodging, and I'll come and I'll do it pro bono for the good of the people. Okay, so the next thing that I have an issue with is the narrative. So this book is focusing on Istvan, right? The first problem with doing a book about Istvan is that everybody knows how it ends, right? This is a hopeless struggle that the loyalists are crushed and utterly defeated, right? Ferrus Manus is decapitated by Fulgrim. The loyalists are utterly defeated, forced to flee, and the three legions, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands, are shattered and basically removed from the Horus Heresy as a coherent fighting force. So we all know what happens. And if you just tell that story again, which has been told in several novels, I believe, it's been told in the Black Books, there's no tension. And unfortunately, that kind of carries over into what's in this book here. In the narrative, there's no real excitement. There's no real reason to read it. And I think there's a couple ways to fix that. You could tell a personal story. You could focus on one single individual and share their experience from the drop to the engagement to the betrayal by the reinforcements to fighting to flee or maybe dying on the field. You know, that could have some real narrative depth to it, and you'd be able to experience the campaign or the battle from the perspective of that one soldier. The other way to do it, I think, is you could focus on a very small portion of the battle with limited stakes, limited objectives. And I think that might be kind of what Games Workshop tried to do here, but I don't think it was successful. And I think they really, if that was what they were trying to do, they just they didn't drill down far enough and pick a particular, like a battalion level engagement, like we're trying to do this to accomplish this. And that means that there's some actual stakes, even though maybe the overall result of the battle doesn't change. There's still something where you can be uncertain of the outcome. And so I think those are the two ways that come to mind for me, where you could tell a story about Istvan and still have it have some interest to it. I think the other problem is just the quality of the writing, and I don't mean to be cruel, but I think the language is really overwrought at times, and that's something that you get with Games Workshop writing almost always. But it seemed to be really accentuated here. And I think writers have to remember that talking about something like it is epic or dramatic, describing it in a dramatic way, it does not make it in and of itself dramatic. And that has to come through your skill as a writer in developing the narrative and making it interesting. Um, you could talk in a high-blown, high-minded way about, I don't know, driving to work, but you're still driving to work. So I think that needs to be toned down, and they need to focus more on making what's actually happening interesting and exciting and involving, rather than using a lot of epic words that are just ornamentation rather than substance. The other problem, I think, with the narrative is that there's no real protagonist. So I guess you could argue that the Salamanders might be the protagonist, in the sense that, of course, this book is called The Ruin of the Salamanders. And perhaps, that might have been another angle you could take with this narrative. And you focus on the Salamanders as a whole, their spirit, their fighting capability. I mean, you could even talk about Vulcan, right? He could be the protagonist, how he's trying to save his legion after they're betrayed, right? That could be an interesting way to do it, and that would give the narrative an anchor to focus on. But unfortunately, it just doesn't have that at this point in either sense. There's no protagonist, whether it's a high-level protagonist, a low-level protagonist, or even the Salamanders as a whole. It doesn't feel that way. That may have been what they attempted to do, to make the Salamanders the protagonist, but if that was the case, I don't feel that they succeeded. There's also no clear plot. It just seems to kind of randomly narrate events that occur throughout the engagement. And I think this is a consequence, a casualty of, I don't know if it's Dan Abnett who started it, and don't get me wrong, Dan Abnett, fine author. I've really enjoyed a lot of his books. But one of the tendencies that he has, and I'm not sure if this is maybe something that started with George R.R. Martin, right, with A Song of Ice and Fire, where every chapter was a different character perspective. And that's something I've noticed in a lot of the Warhammer books, especially with the Siege of Terra and a few others, where every chapter seems to be a different character. And that's fine if you're a skilled author and if there are not too many characters. And this, I think personally, this is something that started to happen even with George R.R. Martin's books, where he's a very good writer, but he kind of started to wash himself out in a way by trying to include all of these characters, and it watered down the narrative in such a way that it took so long to get back around to the same character that the narrative advanced at a glacial pace, and you kind of, for me even, started to forget what was going on with that character in the first place. And I think that can be an interesting device if it's done well, like George R.R. Martin did in the first few books, of A Song of Ice and Fire. But if you can't do it well, and I think sometimes The Siege of Terra and books like this fall into that situation where you sort of, you no longer have a narrative, you just have events being told, and that's not engaging. It also jumps outside the Salamanders sector very often, in a way that's jarring and doesn't augment the narrative. So this book is supposed to be about the Salamanders. It's supposed to be, or at least, I mean, obviously from the title, right? It's about the ruin of the Salamanders, and it just doesn't fit, right? I understand if we need to establish things that are going on outside of the Salamander's direct area of operations. Obviously that can have an effect on the narrative, on how they do what they're doing and why. But it's not always clear why these digressions are relevant, and so I think those should just be removed, unless it's clear why they need to be in there. And it just seems like maybe they got a little confused about what the point of the narrative was. And unfortunately, I have to say that it's just generally unmemorable. I read through this, I found it kind of boring. I didn't think that any of the events that it described, any of the actions were particularly memorable, not particularly creative, just kind of people going here, doing things, shooting stuff. And I just didn't think it was, I didn't think it was worth my time, to be honest with you. And I haven't really felt like that with the other Legions Imperialis narratives. And so I want to contrast it with the narrative in The Great Slaughter, which, I mean, it's certainly not like high literature, but I think as far as Legions Imperialis narrative supplements go, it's like the top tier. And that's because it has a lot of things going for it. It's got a clear plot, right? You're trying to seize the Sapphire City or defend it, depending on your side. There's generally a clear protagonist and antagonist, right? You have the Palatine Lady, the various Space Marine commanders, and the legions are themselves treated in a way as individual characters, right? And I think that may be a positive and successful way to do things. And the book stays focused on the narrative in The Great Slaughter. And everything kind of builds to the slow disintegration of the defenses of the Sapphire City. It starts with the landing. It starts with the taking of other hives, the rebellion of other hives on the planet. And it builds to the final collapse and destruction of the city. And maybe more importantly, there are a lot of moments from that book which are very memorable, like the Palatine Lady that I already mentioned. There's the betrayal of the noble officers. There's the regiment of soldiers, right, that she had recruited from criminals or the lower classes of the hive, and they stayed loyal and defended her against the rebellion of the noble officers. There's the moment, I think, in the attack at the spaceport when the Solar Auxilia like form squares around the Stormhammers, and the Stormhammers use their multi-laser point defense weapons to fight off and defend the infantry from the World Eaters cavalry on jet bikes. There's the moment when the Astartes use the human shields, all the refugees from the hives that attempted to flee to the Sapphire City. They use them as human shields to try to get close to the walls. There's the battle for the outworks where all the Archaeotech guns are holding off the enemy Titans. There's all these moments that, even though I may not, it's been a while since I've read the book, and I don't necessarily remember the whole course of the narrative, but there's moments that stick in my mind. And this book just doesn't really have that. And even though it spends quite a bit of time focusing on characters, I think it spends almost maybe 3 or 4 pages on individual characters that are involved in, I guess, they're supposed to be involved in the Salamander sector, but they're basically unused. There's 1 or 2 that kind of show up, or it seems like they show up a few times throughout the narrative. but they have basically no personality. They just spout off a few sort of cliched lines, and then they die, or we never hear from them again. So yeah, unfortunately, I have to say the narrative is definitely was a miss for me. Um, as far as the indifferent things, the new formations, the new detachments, I don't really think there's any standouts here. And I'm talking about like from a gameplay perspective. I looked through them, but I didn't see anything that really sparked my interest. And so it's always good to have new options, new detachments, obviously with these new miniatures, new formations that you can change up your army building some. But I didn't find them to be particularly noteworthy. And so that kind of wraps up the detailed review of this book. And so as you can tell, um, personally, I don't particularly think this is worth buying. It is good to have the like a canonical record of what the detachment statistics are, what the formations are, and so on. But for everything else, even accounting for like the great color plates that are in here, the great battle shots, the great miniatures, um, the rest of the content here is just not up to par for me. I think I paid $35 for this, and definitely not worth it. So what's the path forward for Legions Imperialis supplements? And we kind of have to think about that. And I think Games Workshop should be too, because what we have in this book is we have a short narrative that's not particularly interesting. We have some maps, some color plates. Well, we have one map. We have some color plates. We have some battle shots. We have some miniature shots. We have new detachments, new formations, and a new mission. And that's it. That's all you get. Um, so what you're purchasing this book for is to have a record, essentially, of what the statistics are for the formations and detachments. And the rest of the stuff, probably you don't need. So, I mean, maybe the mission. What we've lost, I mean, it's a softcover book. It's not hardcover anymore. There's definitely a lot. There's not as much content. We don't have a campaign system, which isn't necessarily a huge loss, but it's it's something that gives value to the book, right? Not everybody will use a campaign system, but some people might. And we no longer even have that option to use it or not as we choose. And there's nothing interesting like the battle honor system that we got in a previous book. There's not a lot of flavor here. So I think we have to ask ourselves, and I think Games Workshop should be asking themselves too, is are books like this really necessary? Um, I I personally don't think so at the current quality level that they're producing these. And I don't like to say it because I want Legions Imperialis to succeed. I enjoy it, obviously. I made a whole YouTube channel about it. I like the game. I like the miniatures. I like the aesthetic of it. But if this is the standard of product that's going to be released from here on out, at least, these books I will not be purchasing. Um, unless somebody can show me that the content and the quality has been dramatically improved. And whether that goes for you as well, only you can say. If it's important, if you don't have as exacting standards, perhaps as you think I do about narrative and maps, and you enjoyed the narrative here, you don't care about maps, then perhaps this is a good purchase for you, and will continue to be a good purchase for you in the future if Games Workshop continues to produce products like this. I guess the question then is, do you need the books for unit reference? And clearly the answer is no, right? Games Workshop produces cards for the units, for the formations. I personally will just buy those rather than buy a book like this. So what's next for Games Workshop? And I do have a recommendation because I never like to criticize without offering a solution. But this video is already, I think, over half an hour. So I'm going to save my recommendation for how Games Workshop could approach a Legions Imperialis product line for another video. So I hope I'll see you in that video. I hope you'll tune in for that. I think it will be interesting and at least thought-provoking. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.